Okay, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. This is the sixth and final class in the Schiller Institute class series on Lyndon LaRouche's discoveries in the science of physical economy. So today we're going to look at some of the concrete policy proposals that were developed by LaRouche as a direct consequence of his insight into the principles of physical economics. What can we implement where we know we will benefit mankind as a whole? We know this will lead to human economic progress. Now, first, I want to say that many people may know, if you know LaRouche, LaRouche was not an academic. He did not sit in a classroom and blab about all of his philosophical ideas. LaRouche went out and organized. He created an organization. He ran for president. He met with world leaders. He designed economic programs based on the principles of physical economy to help develop the world. So that's the intention here. That's the intention with our class series today. It's not an academic exercise. We want to challenge you that if these concepts are true, if LaRouche's discoveries in economics are true, and I can tell you they are and they're proven, then shouldn't we, who are supposedly a species of reason, capable of guiding our behavior according to what's true and what's right, shouldn't we respond by making sure that those discoveries get implemented into policy? Shouldn't we respond by making sure that we do the greatest good possible today? So the question, what I want you to be thinking about throughout this class is, how are we going to make this happen? How am I going to change society? How are we going to make sure that this happens? And that's really a human identity, to wake up asking yourself, what will I do for all mankind? My life is limited. That's the nature of being mortal. But are you living today for those in the future? Are you living for the majority of humanity? And if we do our job right today, the majority of humanity has not yet been born. So that's what I want to be on your mind as we go through the topics and the ideas presented in the class today. So first I want to say that the first step in thinking about that is to realize that none of what you see going on today in the media, none of people's opinions, none of this political mess out there that people seem to think is so important, none of this is really all that important at all. None of these quote-unquote big issues of the day. The only sane perspective from which to contemplate the situation we find ourselves in today, politically, economically, and otherwise, and to shine a light and help us figure out what is actually significant, what is actually determining the fate of humanity, is to look at it from the future, from that more real state of existence than all of the noise that goes on and that people hear in the media today. So I want you to think, I want you to imagine and really think about where humanity should be 100 years from now. Where should humanity be 500 years from now? Now, 500 years ago was the Golden Renaissance in Italy. So I want you to think about that. Imagine those people 500 years from the future. Imagine them in your mind. They are going to help us see what we ought to be doing now to make that future feasible. So first, we're going to hear from Lyndon LaRouche on this. So can we go to the clip?
This is truly the most important of all strategic questions we have to face today. The fact that the human species, which is absolutely unique in its capabilities, there's no other known species in the universe ever known to have existed or could exist, even though we have not fully explored, of course, the Crab Nebula or similar parts of the great galaxy, which we're involved in, called the Milky Way, there may be many species with cognitive powers out there, because the solar system, of which we are immediately a product, though always under the control of the galactic processes. And we know a good deal today about those kinds of things. Our organization in the United States has spent a good deal of effort on concentrating inclusively on just this question: how old is life? How long has life existed in this galaxy, or within it, some place in it? What is the nature of mankind, who's been on this planet only for a few million years? There was no human being on this planet, to the best of our knowledge, until a few million years ago. And yet, we're talking about billions of years of this galaxy, during which all living processes known to us have come into existence. And all life is creative, but there's a sad part, that over 95% of all known living species have been rendered extinct as failures in their time. The question, therefore, why, in these times, when we've entered a period in which there will be more great kills of living processes at this phase of the movement of the solar system through the galaxy, why should we be so presumptuous as to imagine that human life is not about to disappear as the dinosaurs did in the last great kill? What is there about human beings that says they're not just another animal species ready to get to the chop in the course of their time? The answer is a very little known question. Most people don't have an inkling of what the answer is. As a matter of fact, our societies are run on the basis of people who have no inkling what the human species is. All they can come up with is an explanation of some kind of an animal, with animal characteristics, of pleasure and pain and things like that, that might control the behavior of this animal. So why should we expect that we have a right to claim that the human species is going to survive the approaching point of a great kill in the course of the movements of the solar system up and below and around the galaxy we inhabit? How do we know that this 62 million year cycle is not going to take the human species away, as it's taken so many away before, and then before that, and then before that? And here you all these people talking about politics, they're talking about issues of politics, they're talking about practical opinion and public opinion and differentiations and costumes and all those kinds of things. And here we are, we're approaching the time of the great kill, where everything about us may suddenly disappear. So what are we worried about? If we're going to disappear, why do we worry? Why do we fight it? What is there in us that is not in other living species known to us, that might somehow miraculously pronounce a destiny for our human species which we grant to no other living species? The name for that specific quality which we know in the human species, which does not exist in any other known living species, is a quality of creativity which is absolutely unique to mankind. And if you're not creative, and if you don't understand creativity, you haven't got a ticket to survival yet. Because creativity won't save you unless you use it.
So, how do we face the crisis that LaRouche laid out? How do we embody that principle of creativity that you heard him discuss at the end? So to start to get at that, I'd like to introduce you to someone who you may not have heard of before, but who was a great friend of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, and that is Krafft Ericka. So Krafft Ericka was born in Germany, but he lived in the United States. He was an aerospace engineer, and actually one of the first aerospace engineers. And he was there in Germany in 1942 on the day that the first rocket to ever successfully reach space lifted off the ground. Now, when he was working in the United States in the 1960s, he developed the ability to use hydrogen, liquid hydrogen fuel in rockets. And you might say, okay, fine, great, that's great. But that's the only reason that we are actually able to put human beings up into space today. So that's thanks to Krafft Ericka. And much like Lyndon LaRouche, Krafft Ericka spent most of his life imagining, thinking about the progress of the human species as a whole, thinking about that necessary future state, future new era for mankind. And in the 1980s, Ericka became great friends with Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, and he was actually on the advisory board of the Schiller Institute. Now in 1957, so several decades before that, the year that Sputnik was launched, Krafft Ericka wrote an article called The Anthropology of Astronautics. And in that article, he defined 3 fundamental laws which must govern humanity's nature as a spacefaring species. Now, the laws are philosophical laws, as you'll see in a moment, but they're absolutely coherent with Lyndon LaRouche's discoveries in physical economy, and in that sense, they are also economic laws. So he said, let's get the quote up. He said, the first law, nobody and nothing under the natural laws of this universe impose any limitations on man except man himself. Second law, not only the Earth, but the entire solar system and as much of the universe as he can reach under the laws of nature are man's rightful field of activity. Third law, by expanding through the universe, man fulfills his destiny as an element of life endowed with the power of reason and the wisdom of the moral law within himself. Now, there's a lot you could say about what Krafft Ericka said there, and if you've watched or participated in the earlier classes in this class series, I hope you heard the resonance with Lyndon LaRouche's ideas about economic value, about human population growth, and about resources. But I want to zero in for a second on the third law, where he said, by expanding through the universe, man fulfills his destiny as an element of life endowed with the power of reason and the wisdom of the moral law within himself. Now, Krafft Ericka insisted that humanity has an extraterrestrial imperative. So in other words, yes, humanity emerged on planet Earth in the biosphere, but we are by no means bound to remain here. We're the only form of life we know of who has the power to leave this planet and put life on other planetary bodies. Now, Krafft Ericka said in 1974, we are cosmic creatures by substance, by the energy on which we operate, and by the restless mind that ceaselessly metabolizes information from the infinitesimal to the infinite, and on the infrastructure of knowledge pursues its moral and social aspirations for a larger and better world against many odds. Through intelligences like ourselves, the universe, and we in it, move into the focus of self-recognition. Metal ore is turned into information processing computers, satellites, and deep space probes, and atoms are fused as in stars. I cannot imagine a more foreboding, apocalyptic vision of the future than a mankind endowed with cosmic powers, but condemned to solitary confinement on one small planet. And so, as Kraft Erika said, it is our assignment, so to speak, from the universe to change and develop other planetary bodies, to be the first known polyglobal species. So Kraft Erika considered and really thought deeply about the way in which, for example, when we begin to live and work on the moon in a more sustained fashion, how will humanity change the moon? But then also, how will the moon change humanity? How will it open up new capabilities to us? How will living and working there change our view and our understanding of the galaxy? How will it change our thinking about our role within that galaxy? Now, this is completely coherent with the principles of physical economy. And I want you to think about what we talked about in class 2 on economic value, on what actually has economic value within a physical economic system. Our progress, our ability to perpetually progress and grow, depends upon our unique ability to make discoveries of new principles that give us new powers over the universe and to disseminate those discoveries. They're not limited to one nation or one part of the world, but to spread them throughout society. Now, that's value, and we measure that value in terms of potential relative population density. Okay, now when we do that, when we change the planet, when we reorganize its resources and we put them to work in a new way, when we create new resources, we increase the potential relative population density. And the outcome, the product of the economy is not money or stuff or your uncle's stock portfolio. The product is people. It's people who are more powerful in physical terms, people who are more powerful in cognitive terms, and who have a more powerful moral commitment to do good for future generations. It was on that line of thinking and that commitment that a very fruitful collaboration between Lyndon LaRouche and Kraft Erika arose. And in 1988, which was 4 years after Erika's death, Lyndon LaRouche was running for president. And the centerpiece of his presidential campaign was a program to create that future stage of development of humanity, which was a 40-year development program for the colonization of the moon and Mars. And here you see some screenshots from his 1988 television broadcast as a presidential candidate called The Woman on Mars. And you can contrast that with some presidential performances and campaign performances we've seen of late. But this was LaRouche's program. So I want you right now to think in your mind, what is the potential relative population density of the moon and of Mars? How many people can the moon and Mars support in their current state? And the answer is 0. None. There is 0 possibility for the supporting human life on the moon and on Mars as they so-called naturally occur. So LaRouche, in his presidential campaign, laid out a 6-phase program to change that, to improve their potential to support life. And that 6-phase program would culminate after 40 years in the first crew of scientists and astronauts descending to the surface of Mars to establish the first permanent scientific colony on its surface. Now, if LaRouche had been allowed to become president at the time, that would be occurring in 2027. We would be there. Now, before we would have the capability of doing that, LaRouche said, look, we have to spend the decades leading into this Mars landing, number one, developing our presence in low Earth orbit. Space stations, manufacturing stations, research stations, tons of them, not just one international space station, many research stations built entirely from materials that we bring from the surface of Earth into low Earth orbit. Then we would begin to build up our presence on the moon and around the moon with space stations, with a permanent science research base on the moon. We would have automated industry and mining operations, and we would eventually begin to grow food on the moon and manufacture raw materials and products that would be exported from the moon back to Earth. Then we would begin to visit Mars with teams of astronauts for exploration and with robotic teams. And at the same time, we would build up a fleet of interplanetary rockets and vehicles, some of which would be fusion powered, meaning that people could travel from Earth or from the moon to Mars in a matter of weeks instead of what it currently takes, which is months. We would then put a space station in orbit around Mars. Robotic operations would set up permanent habitats, would set up stocks of cargo and materials and machinery that would be needed for the first Martian settlers. Now, that was LaRouche's program, and he said at the time that this Martian landing occurs, we could have a city of 1 million people on the moon, growing their own food, producing most of their own resources. And I want you to imagine or think through, how would that change the identity of what it means to be human? How would it change the way we organize international relations, the way we organize economic activity? You have people who are born on other planetary bodies, and yet they're human. So how much more will those humans understand about the way the universe works, and how much more good will they have the power to do than what we have today? So now, with their eyes, I want you to look back on 2020, look back on this year. From that future stage of development, what is required now from us to make sure that we get there? Well, what this requires is that in 2020, humanity began to build the world land bridge. So what is this? So this is Lyndon and Helga LaRouche's proposal for a world land bridge. And those lines that you see represent lines of high-speed and maglev rail. Okay, so at first glance, it looks like, okay, you're proposing just to link up all nations of the world with a bunch of trains. Okay, that's not really what this is. What you see here is an old idea which has its roots in the natural tendency of humanity to grow, to develop, to interact as nations, as peoples, unless that development is stopped by an empire system. So the history of this, you had the old Silk Road, which stretched from Asia, from China, through Central Asia and into Europe. You see that here with the red lines on this map. You had Lincoln's Transcontinental Railroad, which was the first in history to cross a continent, which inspired the Trans-Siberian Railroad in Russia. These were natural impulses of humankind to link up and to develop the territory. You also had plans in the early 1900s for a Berlin to Baghdad railroad. Now, this would have linked the industrial centers of Europe to Central and Southwest Asia, what we today tend to call the Middle East, completely disrupting the British Empire's control of global trade through the seas, through the maritime trade routes. This would have been built 100 years ago, except for the little disruption you may have heard of called World War I and then World War II. Okay, now in 1989, after the Berlin Wall fell. LaRouche, who was sitting in prison as a political prisoner at the time and still running a presidential campaign a few years later, LaRouche revived this direction of development. And he said, okay, the Berlin Wall fell. We no longer have a Cold War. We are not going to allow this to become a one-world empire system of the West. So what he proposed was a policy called the productive triangle, which very quickly turned into the world Landbridge. So what LaRouche recognized in the previous policies of rail development is that you're not just looking at rail passing over a certain part of the map. He said what you have to do is you have to treat these rail lines as development corridors. So you have to think that along these routes, you're building new cities, you're building water projects, electrical projects, electricity lines, you're irrigating farmland, you have new universities, you have research, scientific research centers, you have specialty science centers researching mining, agriculture, right? So he said in this way, you deliberately apply the technologies which raise the productive powers of labor. Think back to class 2. You deliberately apply technologies to develop the vast interior of the continents, opening up their resources and their potential to support human life. This unleashes a revolution across all nations of the planet. You raise the potential population density of the planet as a whole, and you do it as a cooperative project, what President Xi Jinping of China is calling win-win cooperation. So I want to highlight one project, a representative project, to give you a sense of how this is going to reshape human life, reshape human activity on the planet and off. And that example is this. We are going to build a tunnel under the Bering Strait. Now, this concept is not new. People have been imagining and thinking about doing this since the late 1800s, but it was never built. Now, what most people don't realize is that the distance between the United States and Russia over the Bering Strait is 55 miles. 55 miles, right? Now, studies have been done, many studies have been done over the years, and some of the most recent studies were done by a friend of the Schiller Institute named Hal Cooper. And the photo is a little bit blurry, but I love it. Here you see Hal Cooper on the right with Helga LaRouche on the left. And what Helga is holding is an illustration of Hal Cooper's proposal for a tunnel under the Bering Strait. And he said what his study showed is that once you've made that connection of those two great continents through this tunnel, you would then link that tunnel crossing to both the North American and the Eurasian rail grids. So on the North American side, we would need 1,400 miles of rail to connect the lower 48 states up through Alaska and to the Bering Strait. 600 miles of that is brand new, doesn't exist yet. On the Eurasian side, we would need 1,800 miles of new rail. And this so here you see Yakutsk in the bottom there, stretching all the way up to the tip of the continent there and across the Bering Strait. Now, by its nature, this has to be built as a cooperative project. No one nation can decide to do this. And a small part of it has already been built in Russia. It's been designated by the government of Russia as being a strategically important railway in their railway strategy for 2050. You've had support from the US side at various points in our history. China has recently expressed interest in being involved to help build it. So this project is really the keystone that would completely revolutionize the world. It brings two great continents together along with their productive powers. It opens up the development of territories. We're talking the northwest part of North America, and the easternmost part of Eurasia, territories which are rich in raw materials, which have incredible scientific potential since they're near the poles, which is a region of our planet's interaction with the environment of space. And these regions currently have a very low potential relative population density. Now, what it also means is that you sitting in New York City or Detroit or San Francisco or wherever you are could hop on a train some evening and wake up having crossed the Bering Strait in China or in Russia. Now, this is just one project which we could start building tomorrow. But it's just one. It's just one which is part of an entire system. And since the 1990s, the Schiller Institute has released a series of reports, which I'm going to show you here. In 1997, we released a special report highlighting the Eurasian land bridge, which became the World Land Bridge. In 2014, we put out an updated version of this report in many languages, including English. And then in 2018, we put out another report which details, I'll show you the inside here. Oh, there we go. There's the Russian site, which details hundreds and hundreds of rail, water, irrigation, agriculture, electricity, science projects on every continent of the globe, which would mean an incredible transformation of humanity. So with the World Land Bridge, by fully developing the infrastructure systems of the entire planet, we raise the productive powers of labor of billions of people. We change the potential of the territory of the entire globe, which would be the first time that humanity would act in concert with a unified intention to raise the productive potential of our planet. And by doing this, by implementing this, we put humanity, all of humanity, into a position to have the massive productive and creative output, the massive free energy output which is necessary to carry out the colonization of the moon and Mars. So the question is, how do we begin to build it? How do we build the World Land Bridge? And in a sense, it's already underway. Ideas have power in them. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, for example, includes many of these development corridors. And it's no surprise because Helga LaRouche is known in China as the Silk Road Lady. So the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative includes many of these. But the major obstacle we face today is the old paradigm. It's geopolitics. It's the ideas that we discussed in the first class, these ideas of economics, which are based on the power of the stronger, which are based on the quote-unquote right of the empire to loot the resources of other nations. It's the outlook which sees the development of one nation as an inherent threat to your nation. This is an evil, old idea which is collapsing. And we've reached a point today where that financial system built upon that ideology is bankrupt. It will not last. Where people around the world are rejecting that system. They're rejecting the idea of endless war. People are rejecting the bailouts of these bankrupt financial criminals. And many nations who are part of the so-called third world, the underdeveloped world, are no longer accepting the idea that they should always be underdeveloped and that they shouldn't have access to the most modern technologies. So it really is a moment of global revolution for the good. And now, in the midst of that, and quite lawfully, unfortunately, we have a global pandemic, which has exposed, laid bare the economic effects of that system. And if we look here, we see the reality of the unemployment situation in the United States in this slide. So let's look at this for a moment. Here in both of these bars, you see the total employable population. And what you see is that the green and blue segments of that bar are people who are employed productively. The red and light red portions, which make up around 70% of the labor force, are either unemployed or not productively employed. Now, if we go to the globe, we see that what we're dealing with is a population which is either unemployed or employed in the informal economy. And what we mean by informal economy is people who are living hand to mouth, who are scraping by, subsistence agriculture, hawking things on the street, drug dealers, right? And so on and so forth. People who are scraping by with their existence. You're talking about more than 60% of the planet's total labor force, which is in a category of waste, right? Forced into it by this system. Now, if we think about just young people, 77% of all youth employment is in the informal economy. So you're talking about 2 billion people. This is a crisis. And you add to that the immediate need, the demand of real physical health infrastructure in many, many parts of the world if we're going to have a chance at controlling this pandemic. So I say all that to say that we have an opening now to force through this desperately needed policy, which is not just necessary to solve the immediate crisis, it's a conscious reversal of the old, evil, old paradigm economic system. It's the first step into a new paradigm of economics. And if we can shape that step, it can very quickly become the first steps of the global policy of the World Landbridge. And if we look at that with the eyes of the people who will be born on Mars, it will be what made their lives possible. So I'd like to end by reminding you of what I said at the beginning. This class series is not meant to be some academic exercise. We have the policies that you can study. You can become part of fighting to implement this. And it really is an issue of what you choose to do with your life. And I know you thought this was an economics class, and here I'm talking to you about what you're going to do with your life. But that's the issue. We are all here for a limited time. The question is, what do you do? Are you content to continue to go along with a rotten, dying, evil system like the one that has brought us to this point? Or are you going to be somebody who those future people on the moon, on Mars, and beyond are not ashamed of? People that they look to as responsible for the possibility of their existence. So I'm going to end there, and I invite everyone to further study these policies and to organize with us. Make these policies a reality.